Aerodynamic stalls on final approaches are a leading cause of small aircraft crashes. Pilots who do not monitor their speed may end up traveling too slowly for the air to support them. However, this type of crash is almost unheard of on passenger airplanes. That is why the fate of Turkish Airlines Flight 1991 is so perplexing. How could a modern passenger jet, such as the 737 involved in this accident, stall and crash on the final approach, only 1.5 kilometers from one of Europe's busiest airports? A failure of one of the aircraft systems, as this episode will demonstrate, would expose a slew of psychological flaws in the cockpit. This story raises questions about how humans interact with technology and who is in charge as the divide between man and machine widens. It also investigates the troubling role that Boeing may have played in concealing its responsibility for the crash. Turkish Airlines Flight 1991 departed Istanbul from a Turkish airport on February 25, 2009, bound for Amsterdam Schiphol Airport. There were 128 passengers and 7 crew members on board. Murat Caesar, the first officer, had a particularly memorable flight. He had only flown 17 flights since joining Turkish Airlines, and he had never flown to Amsterdam before. As a result, a safety pilot accompanied him and his captain in the jump seat. This man, Aljaskor, was there to help the pilots with their increased workload and ensure that the new team followed procedures. The pilots didn't realize it, but this flight would increase their workload. The captain's radio altimeter, which measures the aircraft's height above ground, was malfunctioning. This instrument reads -8 feet, regardless of their height above the ground. Despite how strange this was, it should have been a minor issue. After all, the first officer's instrument was functioning properly. The 3.5-hour flight to Amsterdam continued as planned as the aircraft climbed into the skies above Eastern Europe. To better understand the sequence of events that will occur during the final approach, consider how the radio altimeter interacts with the autopilot. In the final few seconds before landing on the runway, a plane must pitch up slightly to slow its rate of descent and land softly. Flare is a maneuver in which the plane pitches up slightly. When the pilots flare close to landing, they also reduce engine thrust to idle, allowing the plane to continue to descend even as it pitches up. The 737-800, like most modern passenger aircraft, has an autopilot that can land the plane on its own. However, autopilots are very basic machines that rely on a few key pieces of information to ensure that the aircraft is about to land. The 737's autopilot requires 3 pieces of information to confirm this. Firstly, it needs to confirm that the autopilot panel has not selected any target altitude. This ensures that the pilots aim to land on the runway rather than at 20,000 feet. The autopilot must also be aware that the flaps are set at an angle greater than 12.5 degrees, which occurs only when the aircraft is close to landing. Finally, the plane is directly above the runway, hovering less than 27 feet above the ground. When the autopilot meets these 3 criteria, it will switch the engines back to idle, enabling the proper execution of the flare. Consider the captain's malfunctioning altimeter from a few moments ago, and you'll understand the situation. Let's return to the flight. At 10:15 a.m., as the aircraft descended through 8,000 feet in the skies above the Netherlands, an audio alert sounded in the cockpit. This indicated that the landing gear was not down, despite the aircraft's expectation that it should be. The captain correctly identified the cause of this false warning. The plane was receiving altitude information from a broken radio altimeter, which indicated that the aircraft was 8 feet below the ground. He mentioned this to the crew, and they continued toward Amsterdam. They began preparing for landing, and the captain contacted Turkish Airlines ground handling company to inform them of the number of passengers on board and to inquire as to where the plane would park following landing. Aside from the bothersome radio altimeter, there was one other minor issue. As we will see, these 2 issues will combine in the most unfortunate way, killing 9 people on board and injuring over 100 others in a matter of seconds. The airspace around Schiphol is among the busiest in the world. As a result, controllers often clear pilots for shorter approaches to save time. As a result, the aircraft will occasionally make their final turn towards the runway while still in the air. Typically, a plane will intercept the ideal glide path from below and slowly descend toward the runway. On this day, however, Turkish 1951 must intercept the glide path from above. The pilots must descend faster than usual in what is known as a slam dunk approach. To accomplish this, the first officer flying the aircraft activated the autopilot's vertical speed mode, which controls how quickly the plane climbs or descends. To intercept the glide sub, he adjusted the descent rate to 1,400 feet per minute. This is roughly twice the average descent rate for this stage of flight, but this procedure was not uncommon at Schiphol. However, selecting this mode met all three conditions for the autopilot to initiate the flare maneuver. As a result, the auto throttle returned the engine thrust to idle, assuming that the plane was only seconds away from touchdown. The pilots were unaware that the autopilot had entered flare mode because they expected the thrust levers to return to idle when they requested a rapid descent. The pilots now had less than 60 seconds to realize that the aircraft's computers had a completely incorrect picture of where it was. At 10:25, the plane crossed the glide path from above. The plane was now back on a normal vertical course, and it needed to increase thrust to maintain its shallower descent rate. However, the aircraft's computers still believed that the plane was just above the runway, so they did not push the throttles forward. Instead, to avoid falling below the glide slope, the autopilot began to raise the aircraft's nose. As a result, the speed increased significantly. In less than a minute, the airplane would stall. Meanwhile, the captain and first officer were completing the pre-landing checklist. As they prepared the plane for landing, they diverted their attention to other parts of the cockpit, failing to notice the speed drop or the nose rise. With about 1 minute to go until landing and less than 500 feet above the ground, the stick shaker activated, indicating that the aircraft was about to stall and fall from the sky. The safety pilot warmed up the crew with an airspeed of 107 knots, significantly lower than the correct approach speed of 144 knots. The first officer immediately pushed the engine throttles forward and lowered the nose to avoid a stall. But then the captain announced that he was taking control of the plane. The first officer let go of the controls, and the autopilot immediately returned the engine thrust to idle. The captain kept pushing the nose down and eventually pushed the throttles to a complete stop. However, the aircraft lacked the necessary altitude to recover from the stall. Just 15 seconds after the stall warning sounded, the plane crashed into a field 1.5 kilometers from the runway. On impact, the aircraft broke into 3 pieces and came to rest just a short distance from where it had first collided with the ground. The crash killed 3 pilots, a cabin crew member, and 5 passengers. 117 passengers were injured, many seriously. Passengers who were able to exit the aircraft quickly through the doors and holes in the fuselage began to stagger away from the wreckage, fearing an explosion. 60 ambulances have arrived at the scene, transporting nearly 100 passengers to the hospital. Shortly after, survivors' accounts of the crash to the media revealed the main cause of the accident: an aerodynamic stall as the plane approached land. Passengers described the plane dropping like a stone and feeling like it had fallen into a void. However, this was a modern passenger aircraft with a safety pilot on board. Why didn't the pilots notice the impending stall, and what role did the radio altimeter play? The Dutch Safety Board's investigation into the crash revealed that Boeing knew about the consequences of a faulty radio altimeter on the autopilot as early as 2004. There have been 5 reports of 737 aircraft entering flare mode incorrectly during approach. In each of these cases, the crew quickly recognized the error and regained control of the aircraft. Boeing issued a software fix in 2006 to address this issue, but it only affected aircraft built after 2006. Built in 2002, the Turkish Airlines 737 involved in this crash was unable to receive the software update. Boeing did not consider this a safety issue, however, because pilots could simply turn off the throttle and fly the plane themselves when it occurred. Indeed, that is exactly what the 12 crews who dealt with this issue prior to the 2009 accident flight did. In fact, many more crews had encountered this issue, but their reports had not reached Boeing. Therefore, the accident's final report suggested enhancing reporting mechanisms to enable airline manufacturers like Boeing to comprehend the full extent of issues before they lead to accidents. The question remains as to why the crew of this flight failed to notice the impending stall. This flight, if anything, should have been safer than the others. Unlike their Airbus counterparts, Do not actively monitor which mode the autopilot or to track the pilot's gaze during a typical flight, as depicted in this image. The dots in this image represent the points where a pilot fixed his gaze during a 1-hour flight. As you can see, he rarely glanced at the FMA, which displayed autopilot modes on the screen. Not the pilot's fault. Their training doesn't require them to monitor changes in automation mode. Other studies have found that traditional airspeed dials, which one can glance at out of the corner of one's eye and understand visually without any additional mental effort, are more intuitive than the modern digital airspeed display. The investigation also focused on the pilot's decision to continue with the approach despite the fact that they did not meet the criteria for a stabilized approach under company procedures. These procedures mandated that pilots abandon an approach if they did not complete the landing checklist by 1,000 feet above the ground, if the throttle levers were not in the correct position, or if the speed was excessive. Despite not meeting any of these criteria on this flight, the pilots maintained their approach. This is not unusual, though. Pilots frequently continue their approaches, regardless of whether they meet the official criteria for a stable approach. The only criteria they tend to use is the one that comes to mind. Is there any reason why this landing is obviously not going to work? This is a clear example of how regulatory and airline procedures fail to account for human nature. However, this is where another minor anomaly in the flight came into play. The pilots began their descent high, so when they attempted to intercept the glides out from above and the autothrottles engaged flare mode, they mistook the reduced engine thrust for the autothrottle, attempting to slow the plane down during its faster-than-normal descent. At least a dozen other cases, where pilots discovered they had incorrectly activated the flare mode, would have avoided this unfortunate timing. Finally, neither pilot error nor automation malfunction were to blame for the crash. Rather, the crash was the unfortunate outcome of both pilot error and automation malfunction. This crash demonstrates how seemingly minor errors can combine in the worst possible way, resulting in a fatal outcome. Following the crash, Boeing issued a warning that erroneous radio altimeter readings could cause the autopilot to enter flare mode. Turkish Airlines also added pilot training on how to recover from low-altitude stalls. All airline pilot simulation training should incorporate this train, according to the final report. An intriguing development in this story occurred in 2020, when a New York Times investigation claimed that Boeing had successfully coerced the Dutch Safety Board into downplaying its role in the accident. According to the New York Times investigation, the Dutch Safety Board excluded and downplayed criticisms of Boeing in its final report, focusing instead on the pilots' roles in the accident. The Dutch Safety Board denied the charge, but you can decide whether that denial is credible. We launched a new investigation into the crash last year, but both Boeing and the U.S. National Transportation Safety Board still await the outcome of this new inquiry. If you enjoyed this video, subscribe to our weekly air crash documentaries. Please let me know in the comments if there are any air accidents or incidents you would like to see covered, and I will do my best to include them in future videos. Thank you again for watching.